We are beginning this session of the day with our first presentation. I'll wait till everybody's seated. The afternoon presentation that starts our session is Zohar Kampf. Zohar was one of the students that followed Shoshana in her work, and he's done a lot of interesting work, and now he's at the same department, and so we see you as a real follower.
Wow.
Happy to have you here, and you will take it from here.
Thank you, Elite, and thank you all for coming. I will start with several words, memory of Shoshana. So 2 weeks elapsed since Shoshana passed away, and it is overwhelming to see the reactions of so many scholars from all corners of the world to the saddening news. I received condolences from both junior and senior scholars of language use, telling me, as if I didn't know, that Shoshana ruled an ocean of wisdom and had a lovely, unique personality. Shoshana crossed borders of scholarly ideologies, from linguistic politeness and pragmatic scholars through conversational and broadcast talk analysts to critical discourse scholars. All of these academics, well, I'm excited, I have to say. I'm not used to it, but all of these scholars that in regular days are busy in drawing intellectual boundaries communicated their consensual aspiration and appreciation to Shoshana's work and menschhood. Today I would like to celebrate Shoshana's wisdom, diversity, and openness by presenting our mutual work on dispute settlements in two important arenas of social development, the kindergarten and the parliament. What? The kindergarten and the parliament, yes, I'm okay. So I chose to present this work not because it is most methodologically rigorous. Oh, that's another one.
No, this is the
yes.
microphone. That is for the
Okay, so I chose to present this work not because it is most methodologically rigorous, it is certainly not, but because it is what I find the greatest lesson Shoshana taught us. By listening to children talk, new words are discovered. These words are rich, sophisticated, and creative beyond what we can imagine, or rather remember as adults. The treasure of childhood that once was at hand were forgotten by so many of us. Shoshana never forgot. And I'll start with the rationale for comparing children and politicians. And we followed the idea of Miller in arguing that by using metaphorical thinking, we can shed new light on the social reality examined. And we started looking for metaphors and found probably one of the most popular one in political communication, the game metaphor, whereby similarities are drawn between politics and sports. A second metaphor, probably unique to the Israeli political culture and used specifically for news coverage of parliamentary debates, is politics as kindergarten. For Israelis, this metaphor suggests a basic similarity in the behavior of the two communities, evoking regulatory view of the interaction between children. So in this paper, we took these metaphors as a starting point for examining conflict resolution mechanisms within these two very different Israeli communities. Without drawing direct comparison, we analyzed interactions of peer politicians and peer children in order to gain fresh insights regarding both these communities and Israeli culture in general. And as we shall see today, the kindergarten metaphor does not hold. There is no basis for assumption of similarity between politicians and children. Not because politicians do not behave in what we can entitle and generally consider as childish manner, but because children themselves refute the stereotype. So our broad aim here in this study was to explore the mechanisms of conflict resolution in both communities, to show how self and other faiths are manifested and negotiated during conflict and resolutions, and to ask to what extent cultural ways of speaking are echoed in the relational work of Israeli children and politicians. Theoretically, our exploration of dispute resolution in two such different communities rests on two further major considerations. The first is that both groups are treated in the literature as distinctive communities of practice characterized by specific language use and operating in specific fields of human interaction. As Catherine convincingly showed, children peer talk is a major area for understanding how discursive skills are developing during peer interactions and how childhood culture, including models of appeasement, is created by children's distinctive practices. As for politicians, sociologists, as well as discourse scholars have demonstrated the distinctive logic of the political field, which influences both political face management and political use of language, politicians' use of language. As we found it theoretically interesting to unveil the dynamics of dispute settlement discourse unique to each one of these groups. And the second theoretical strand is that on which we put our assumption on, is that both groups are exposed to and manifest cultural ways of speaking related to their being Israelis. And here Shoshana's earlier work from the 80s and the 90s, and also Tamar Katriel's work, underline Israeli speech community preference to clarity and authenticity, what we call dugri. And this preference is, this style is preferred over other relational, more polite modes of talk. And later studies drew attention to the process of erosion of Israeli style of speaking, paralleling the decline in collective values in Israeli society. These processes brought about both mitigated and elaborated types of talk, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, emergence of an offensive style of talk that we used to in our parliament and termed Kasach. And again, tracing the role of Israeli cultural values in the discourse of the two communities allows us for better understanding the current Israeli systems of politeness. So the data and method, the data here was collected during two very, very different research projects, both concentrating, this is the similarity, both focused on apologetic behavior, one of children and the other one of politicians. The first project focused on, as we all know, on pragmatic developments and was based off children and based on ethnographic observation of peer interactions of Israeli children. We analyzed 1,362 minutes of natural peer interaction between preschool children and looked for their involvement in remedial events, in disputes, and how do they correct the relationship. The second project analyzed the role of apologists in conflict resolution in the Israeli political arena. Here the data consists of 559 events reported in the printed press between 1997 and 2004. And in what follow, I will demonstrate, I use only strategic examples to demonstrate first the way of settling conflicts among children, among Israeli children, and second, ways of magnifying conflicts among Israeli politicians. So we start, of course, with children, and our first question is, what makes children's settlement of dispute strategies so unique? And first, in line with the idea of children peer discourse as double opportunity space, we argue that children use cultural resources and normative scripts from both children's world and adults' world. Resources and norms unique to children's world are fantasy, popular culture, as well as deep commitment to sociality. Children direct their efforts to managing disputes in ways that echoes their culture and will not threaten the basic ties of friendship, ties which serve as precondition for peer communication and play. Second, the management of disputes by preschoolers is an occasion for enlisting a wide range of argumentative strategies, and here is a list of argumentative studies with the strategies that we found in this interaction, and I will demonstrate at least 3 of them. So let's start by the first one, preempting conflictual situation. And sensitivity to faith concern may lead children to adopt preemptive strategies which work to nullify the possibility of direct conflicts. In our first example, and I only chose those that Shoshana were the favorite ones of Shoshana. So here 2 boys are standing next to the book corner in the preschool, leafing through a picture book with animal pictures and pointing out and naming the animals in the book. At one point, one of the boys introduces a pretend play framing, invites his friend to join in the game of fantasy. The 2 children collaborate, as we see in turn 1 and 2, collaborate in perfect synchrony, the magical transformation of the squirrels in the picture to a virtual pet. Collaboration is enabled through 2 preemptive strategies. First, by insistence of inclusive joint action. Raphael, on turn 1, begins his suggestion by naming both himself and his friend as the doers in the suggested plot, then slips into I, as you can see, but immediately self-repairs back to we. In this way, makes sure that both children are granted equal rights in their realization of the pretend play. In the next turn, 2, Rami go a step further, exploiting the unlimited possibilities of the fantasy frame, in which anything can happen. He suggests using magic to double the symbolic object of the play. This move reflects children's cooperation with issues of ownership, occupation with issues of ownership, whether real over toys or symbolic, as in the case of these virtual squirrels. The magic transformation of doubling the squirrels function as preemptive move. Once there are 2 virtual squirrels, no conflict can arise over ownership of the symbolic objects of the play. This can be a great idea, doubling everything with magic. And the play can continue in perfect synchrony. As we saw, the children lift the squirrels from the book and walks away holding them on the palm of their hands. They put the squirrels in the imaginary cages, singing them songs and planning ahead for the return of the pets to the book. So this is the first preemptive strategy. The next one is managing sociability during disputes. So let's look now on a way to maintain conversational cooperation in argumentative events and adhere to the standards of political, but what we will see now, adhere to the standards of commercial and political experts' negotiations. So in the following case, this is done by the avoidance of direct refusals. The children negotiate over highly valued possession, a particular Pokemon sticker. Here it is, by the way. Displaying persuasive strategies countered by indirect, sophisticated, and polite modes of refusal. The children are sitting around the table, drawing Pokemons, looking at a booklet of Pokemon stickers, and talking. The argumentative event between the children starts with a polite request for a particular sticker. See turn 3. Could you give me a Pokeball sticker? Please, only one. Instead of overtly refusing, Gadi counters by using the strategy of justifying his refusal. As the bargaining goes on, Gadi continues avoid direct refusals, opting for various indirect strategies. In turn 16, he tries to mobilize his audience and speaks of his opponent in the third person, repositioning him from an addressee into an overhearer. In the next refusal, in turn 26, Gadi combines several strategies. First, he makes a concession that helps to retain the illusion of conversational cooperation. No right. Second, he uses a conditional statement that constrains the concession, and if I give you. And finally, he evokes the voice of his older sister, an authoritative third party, to completely annul the possibility of compliance with a mere request. By the way, his sister was her age was 9 years old, and then my sister would scream at me. So this example shows that as children negotiate over stickers, they also negotiate social relations. Due to their deep commitment to sociality, they express clearly oppositional acts by realizing face-saving indirect moves. In this case, they are drawing on adult practices, as in business negotiations. The participants avoid direct moves of corrections or disagreement and try to manage disagreement by not displaying it too overtly. Let's move now to my favorite one, apologies. And the next episode demonstrates how reconciliation is sophisticatedly co-constructed by peer rivals. The confrontational event stems from a fight over a stick, during which Yoav, one of the children, receives a blow from Ariel. When Ariel realizes the seriousness of the blow, Yoav started to cry. He repeats sorry, sorry at least 14 times, but to no avail. The boys avoiding each other for a few minutes until Ariel approaches Yoav with a new proposition. So as Ariel and Yoav negotiate, as we see in turns 78 and 79, they negotiate the new idea of play. So we may think that the previous incidents completely forgotten by both. But Ariel's reference to the unpleasant incident in turns 88 and 84, I didn't mean to do it to you, and I didn't mean to do it to you at all, sheds new light on the whole exchange, turning it into a carefully planned remedial event performed in stages. Ariel's moves seem to resemble the trust-building measures diplomats talk about in the context of international conflict resolution. The first stage consists of an attempt to reestablish mutual trust as friends by proposing a joint play using solidarity politeness markers, LETs, that suggest common ground. It is only after the offer is fully embraced by Yoav, the offended party, and the shared commitment to renewed friendship is firmly established, that reference is made to the previous incident. The renewal of friendship, which is expressed verbally through each child echoing the other let's utterance, works here to build the trust needed for reconciliation. In this mutually supportive context, Ariel's repeated denial of intent in turn 82 and 84 is accepted, and we witnessed its success through the children's full collaboration in the new play frame. So this is how children manage their disputes, and we can see this creative with a sense of sociability, sociality, and friendship at the core, and I will return to this specific point at the conclusion, but let's now move to politicians. So our definitions, or our definition of politicians as member of community of practice is based on what John Thompson is a sociologist entitles The Double Logic of Politics. In contemporary mediated political arenas, politicians are compelled to manage their persona, their face vis-a-vis, first, the general public, but also with respect to their rival and peer politicians. During their various types of peer interactions, politicians are constantly occupied with the mission of enhancing their own face while threatening their rival face. Observing this practice in everyday politics that we can look at on television every night may leave us with the impression that politics is nothing but, and here's the quote from Thompson, nothing but an esoteric world of internal squabbles of a Byzantine power struggle. However, for the politicians themselves, these squabbles are part of the very essence of politics because it allows them to distinguish their own position from those of their opponents. Indeed, looking at ways in which politicians manage disputes, we can see that such events serve in their continuous effort to maximize symbolic power at the expense of other members within the political community. So our example focus on the ways in which the offended party invests efforts to keep his hurt feeling on the public agenda in order to gain greater public exposure. The incident that took place at the 2002 Labour Party convention began with an insult directed by Minister Benjamin Ben-Eliezer, the Labour Party chairman, Dalia Itzik, the Minister of Industry and Trade. Itzik had spoken against the unity government, and following her, Ben-Eliezer went to the podium and titled her speech as a big bluff. Big bluff, big insult. And Itzik demanded an apology. And Ben-Eliezer, who needed Itzik's support in order to stabilize his position as the party chairman, made two separate apologies, both rejected by Itzik. First, he tried to call her, but Itzik never answered. And the second one, after this refusal, Ben-Eliezer made a second attempt to placate her. In front of the entire government ministers, Ben-Eliezer turned to Dalia Itzik and said, "I love you, Dalia. You're an excellent minister. I apologize for the thing I said that hurt you at the party convention." I find it a very chauvinist remark, but that's a need. He needed support. We can see a performative marker. This is a true apology in terms of the words. We have a performative mark, an acknowledgement of responsibility, a support of the positive face of Itzik, I love you, and also reinforcing a political skill, a professional face with complementing her professional virtues. So we have it all, but Itzik refused. Also this apology, because she made her forgiveness conditional on one more statement to be performed publicly before the Labour Party convention. That is a much larger audience. So Ben-Eliezer agreed, and Itzik's refusal and insistence on the spectacle of public apology can be understood as a means for keeping the chairman deaf to her on the public agenda. And we can see this in a comment to Ben-Eliezer, and this is Ben-Eliezer, if you, after he had fulfilled the demand, "Your offense was very helpful. I should have sent you a bucket of flowers." So this is how you can use hurt feelings and insults in order to gain media visibility. And Itzik reference to the advances that issues from the serving as the voice of dissent may indicate that their taking offense was calculated attempt to gain political points. In politics, the sincerity condition is frequently replaced by the embarrassment condition. That is, the extent to which the gesture is perceived by the forgiver as threatening the apologizer's political face. Itzik violated the sincerity condition by being insulted, and justified a recount refusals and a demand for reparation in terms of giving equal publicity to the apology statement. A self-positioning as victim within the Labour Party awarded her higher position in the political hierarchy as a person who is important enough to be the recipient of apology and to award absolution. Within this broader political field, keeping the insult of the public agenda granted her with greater public exposure, and I'm now turning to the conclusions. So politics as kindergarten. The example of children's, that would be more, the examples of children's mode of conflict management in natural peer talk suggest that the metaphor of politics as kindergarten is unjust to the children. Children manifest a gamut of sophisticated strategies for conflict management and resolution, which are geared toward maintaining cooperation despite disagreements. Admittedly, in both community, conflicts may end in the opposite direction, with escalation and separation in children's conflict and cooperation and resolution in politicians' conflict. However, different phase concerns motivate the conduct of the members in the respective communities. collective phase concerned in children's world, and ego-centered phase in politicians' world. So as for politician, it seems that the game metaphor that we started this talk with is aptly characterizes the internal logic of political field. Political dispute may be considered on what Zimmel calls an antagonistic game, in which the fascination of fight and victory itself is the exclusive motivation. In an era of political personalization, with a growing need for media attention, magnifying conflict becomes a useful strategy for winning the media game and attain visibility. On the other end, the centrality of friendship may explain how collective phase concerns arise in the world of children. Corsaro argues that the concept of friendship in the preschool years is mainly built on the need for collaboration in play. Your friends are the children you play with. And since peer interactive space are difficult to enter, children develop relations with several playmates as a way to maximize the probability of successful entry. Our observations suggest that friendship in itself seems to be conceived as the major precondition for gaining access to play. Once the interactive space of play is created by friends, the children share a collective goal to maintain the space. Disputes may be taken as face-threatening not only to the offended party, but also to the collective shared face of the children as friends. Since it is friendship that is jeopardized, children make effort to minimize the threat and settle their disputes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zohar. We have 5 minutes for questions, comments?
In terms of generalizations, and that it varies between boys and girls, children, and that children politicians, so we have more of a
specific.
Yeah.
I would call this, by the way, this is not a very typical research for Shoshana. This is more of an intellectual play that we've made with both of our materials. With Shoshana materials on children disputes and talk, and specifically to this study we used the materials of preschool children aged between 4 and 6. These were our materials, the idea of kindergarten. And we use our mind, very different materials, not natural discourse, reported speech of reports from newspapers and from broadcast news, on politician disputes. We collected these instances, and then we used what we find very helpful in this case, the idea of metaphorical thinking. Also to look at metaphors, but to think metaphorically on two communities that are very separate in nature, and to put one by another and see what we can find. And indeed, I can say that, and I'm standing behind the main idea I presented here, that friendship is a core norm in children's play, in preschoolers, in the kindergarten, because they need to play, they need a shared space, and friendship is major here, while threatening in the political world, in parliament, threatening the other is face, and that is, I would say, the opposite of friendship. Not to perform friendship is a basic condition for gaining media visibility, and we can see that in the news reports and so forth. So
what would you say is the source of the metaphorical transfer between the idea of politicians and
yeah, I almost said that during that, but I wouldn't. I think politicians are behaving more or less like child, no. Let me put it differently. If we see the political action and politicians not in the derogatory way, in the good way, we can affiliate many features coming from politics, engagement, and standing on one's right to children's interaction, and not the vice versa.
One more question.
Could you relate your findings to the Israeli cultural context?
Yeah.
Are these going to be...
Yeah, for this study, I just put them aside, but if we can see, if Israeli culture is built on the idea of degree and directness and so forth, so maybe there is I think there is a contradiction between the idea of the general Israeli culture, who is more oriented to directness, and the preemptive strategies that we just saw within the children world. So here we have to take the idea of two types of culture: the general adult culture, the Israeli culture, the Sabra culture, the Dugri culture, and the children culture, childhood culture. And I would say that in the kindergarten, childhood culture, that would mean culture 2, is more prominent, is more central. This culture is on the background of this culture, we can better understand how children communicate and negotiate.
So that's a very interesting claim, that there's a kind of a natural sociability in children that maybe has to be trained into a particular direction to enable them to become members of the adult culture. But I was actually...
This is an...
You can respond to that.
Yeah.
But so your analysis has been of Israeli politicians interacting in
the parliament.
In parliament, in Hebrew, with each other. And I'm wondering how this sort of analysis of sort of the threat and the value of the threat and the value of keeping open opportunities that are closed off when threats become too strong translates into cross-national political discourse. Are people more cautious in
when interacting with political figures abroad?
Yeah.
Yes, this is.
Bibi is perhaps not
yeah.
a good example of that.
Well, I'm just now started to write a paper on the politics of insults. Politics of insults? What does it mean to be insulted? Not to insult someone, because there's a lot of writing about it. What does it mean how do politicians use insult as strategic move? And I found several instances of Israeli politicians interacting with international politicians. And I can say first that, for example, in peace negotiation, all the time collapses in digression because of the speaking style. For example, in the Israeli-Jordanian negotiation, Israeli negotiators insulted Jordanian negotiators just because of not understanding the codes of speaking. And in international affairs, I found several instances of Yvette Lieberman, not surprisingly, and Benjamin Netanyahu insulting Ashton Kutcher, not Ashton Kutcher. Oh my God. Catherine Ashton. Well, that is very embarrassing, but again, you know, Catherine Ashton, in communicating with the European Union, blaming them. So there might be clashes because of this type of this specific kind of Kazakh and Israeli speaking style that when negotiating with others.
I think at all levels, probably.
Yeah.
One more question and then we'll go on.
It's more of a comment rather than a question. What suddenly occurred to me as I was reflecting on the comparison between the politician and the children, that the context of the children's argument, coming to agreement, negotiation, is the interaction between the two of them and the play, the object of the play, you know, dealing with offense. But what struck me in the case of the politician is that there is a third party. It's either the audience in the party's gathering that Daria is considering, or what was the other example, suddenly slipped from my, but there is an audience there, or there is another third party involved in it. So
There's always,
yes. Other listener.
No, the idea of surveillance, of ongoing surveillance by cameras, by journalists.
That's what you meant.
Yes.
Yes. Here is the media.
Yes, and this is probably one of the major reasons for behaving like that when the cameras are on. But I would say that there's also third parties in the kindergarten. This is what we found, the idea of the teacher that's standing there. In apologetic terms, the idea of the existence of the teacher over there always affect these struggles, because you can always tell the other children first, and you have to say explicitly the word slicha, sorry, many times to appease the teacher. And I think the main argument in our study is that let children solve their problems alone, because they have much more sophisticated ways to settle dispute that we can remember.
Thank you very much, Zohar.
Thank you.
The next presentation is Chava Teubal. I use your Hebrew version of the name. Chava, I know, was a very close friend of Shoshana's, and also she was the motivating force behind this colloquium. So, Chava, yes. The floor is yours.
No, excellent. Before I present the book, and in order to be able to control myself, I would like to read a few words about Shoshana that were written collectively by the other three editors of the book. And this book was inspired by Shoshana, and she was the motor behind it. Oh my God, I got the wrong one, just a minute. Shoshana was a rare mixture of intellectual power and integrity, of commitment and involvement in social educational issues. She displayed a unique human and academic generosity and willingness to acknowledge the contribution of others. We feel deeply privileged to have collaborated with her and give thanks for life and work. I personally want to say that I will miss a lot a person who was able to temper my fury at a lot of common issues that provoked my indignation, and Shoshana managed to convince me to channel this fury into a more constructive kind of reaction. Anyway, the name of the book now is Children's Talk, Learning from Each Other. Is there a way I can?
You can leave it there and just use.
No, I like to. Does it work? No. Okay, never mind.
Yeah, someone just left it there and used it.
No. No, אני רוצה לקרוא מפה. Never mind, it's okay. It's okay. לקרוא מפה. תודה רבה, אילית. תודה. Okay, so the name of the book has become Children's Talk, Learning from Each Other. This book is composed of 10 chapters, an introductory chapter and a comment and overview chapter which closes the book. The contributors were from 10 or are from 10 different countries: Italy, Britain, the US, Scandinavia, and Israel. This is relevant for what I'm going to say about the book. It examines different kinds of naturally occurring children peer talk with the goal of bringing to the fore the potential impact of that talk on socialization and learning. When we say it examines different kinds of naturally occurring peer talk, this means it is an innovation when we look at it with the background of 5 decades of child language, which were mainly characterized by laboratory work conducted with a focus on the talk of the individual child, with honorable exceptions. But the idea here is not to argue about the contribution of adult interaction with children, but the idea is to give the importance that needs to be given to the impact that peer interaction has on the learning and socialization process. Now, the premise of the book is that children's language and pragmatic development occurs in a variety of socio-cultural contexts. It is a socio-culturally, spatially, and temporally situated process. And children are seen by all the contributors of this volume as a part of a communicative community. The way children learn from one another when they talk while engaged in socio-cultural practices in a variety of contexts is the focus of the book. And you can see that I am a great believer in graphic texts, also non-verbal graphic texts. So I hope you are all processing the great amount of information conveyed by the photographs here. Anyway, the book brings a new view on the functions of children's peer discourse, with the goal of extending the understanding of language learning potentials beyond adult-child interactions. That is, we grant the importance of adult-child interactions, but we say there is a huge potential which is in many occasions not taken advantage of, because this potential of the interaction between children, between peers, is not acknowledged. There is an interdisciplinary approach in the book to children's peer discourse and culture. There is a sociolinguistic, educational, and anthropological approach. The data from the chapters is, the origin of those data is naturally occurring children's peer interactions to attain in-depth understanding of naturally occurring learning processes. The studies are from a broad range of language communities, and they provide a view of a variety of communicative practices, and this is the reason I listed before the countries from which the authors who contributed in the book come. Now, Shoshana's notion of peer talk as dual opportunity space has been mentioned before, so I won't go through this again. What I shall do now is talk about the chapter in which I participated in this book together with the staff of the preschool department at K College in Beersheba. And when I share with you the examples of this study, then I will try and show you or emphasize how this dual opportunity space is fleshed out in these cases. So the study was about the literate character of pretend play discourse in the wake of a story. This is what this means is that the study was on the discourse of young children produced by the children during pretend play after they were read a story. That is, at this phase, there was an adult, there was a student who read a story to a small group of children in the kindergarten. Once she finished reading the story, she told the children to go and play the story they had just heard. And as she did this, she handed the children a few prompts which were very neutral. What I mean by neutral is that instead of giving, what was it you said about the Elmo? Instead of giving them the Elmo doll, they were giving the sock. So the sock could become whatever it was. So this is something that we learned from a pilot, that from our purposes, from the point of view of our purposes, the interaction around the negotiation of the prompts was so rich that it was a shame to ignore this potential and give them the dolls of Elmo. Okay, so what was the procedure? As I told you, the students read the story and gave the prompts, and then the children played after having heard the story, and a couple of students observed and transcribed. There are 345 transcripts that was the result of that, and 120 of them were video recorded. So the specific point I'm going to be addressing now, the material is very, very rich, so I will not cover all of that, and not even the portion I will cover now is the impact of the original story text upon the ensuing pretend play discourse. This is the issue. Now, a discourse analysis was carried out on 30 of the transcripts, and the coding system was developed in terms of what appeared to us to be relevant categories. Don't worry, I'm not going to go on to this. What I want you to see is that what we are going to be dealing with now is the attitude towards the text, and in particular, what we have called awareness of the text. How did the discourse the children engaged in after being read the story, how did this reflect their awareness of the story text? And what we, yes, before I go into the examples, I want to address the issue of what does it mean to become literate, because as you maybe remember, our purpose was to see whether reading a story to the children and having them play the story would have an impact on the discourse they produced. How much would this discourse be literate? So what are some of the features of becoming literate that I want to mention. The most obvious one is mastering the notational system. Our intervention had nothing whatsoever to do with mastering the notational system, and this was not a coincidence. This was a reaction when the winds blowing in our midst were putting 95% of the emphasis concerning literacy on the mastery of the notational system. We chose to leave it to the people who were so devoted to this issue, and we addressed different issues. So the issues we were interested in was the ability to form and interpret messages, the ability to use a variety of oral and written genre, and you probably, those of you who were around can hear Shoshana saying this, the ability to use a variety of oral and written genre, as well as the ability to construct textually cohesive and coherent stretches of discourse. Now, it is very, very, very accepted that there is an important contribution, an important relation between pretend play and literacy development. I will give you two quotes for that. One is Paul Harris, who has said that the optimal context for the development of abilities involved in processing written texts requires that, well, why is it an optimal context? Because it requires that players temporarily set ongoing reality aside and take the imaginary hero's point of view. And Brunner has said it in somewhat different words. Pretend play offers children an opportunity to practice the ability to disengage from the here and now and enter alternative worlds. So, still another view on pretend play. Keith Sawyer, who has done very important work on pretend play, he emphasizes the part that improvisation has in pretend play, creativity and cooperation, and he speaks about social learning and discourse skills. He has emphasized something that I would like to expand on a little bit, in-frame as well as out-of-frame discourse. This is very important because the amount of time children spend negotiating their play is very frequently seen by many kindergarten teachers, many parents, many whatever you want, is seen as a huge waste of time. The essence of the people in Beersheba who were engaged in this study, one of the aspects of their work was using this as a means to train their future kindergarten teachers. And they arrived at the conclusion that from their point of view, the most important result they got was the fact that their students became aware of how important it is how important that period of negotiation around the play is for children's literacy development. So this was actually a way of conveying the message of the importance of the process and not the product. That is, the importance was not not going through the moves and playing the story. The importance was all that negotiation that was done out of frame. Now, what does it mean in frame? In frame is when the children are actually impersonating the characters in the story, when they are speaking in first person, when they are Red Riding Hood. When they are saying, I am Red Riding Hood, or I am the mother, this is in frame. When they are arguing about it, you always want to be Red Riding Hood, this is the out of frame, okay? So one of the great contributions of Sawyer has been to emphasize the importance of this type of negotiation. Anyway, another important concept is Corsaro's concept of interpretive reproduction. And in our case, what does it mean, interpretive reproduction? Is that as the children elaborate the story, they produce their own creative interpretation of it. That is, the children did not passively reproduce the story, but as they reproduced the story, they introduced their own version of it. And these are actually, what are the questions? The questions were, what is the degree of awareness of the given story text revealed by the children's discourse, and to what extent do children expand the story text? Here, rather than expand, we could say interpretively reproduced the story text. Okay, the example I'll give you now is from children playing the Goldilocks and the Three Bears. These are first graders. And Shai says, and this will be an example of, under the category of adherence to text, the book as source of authority. And Shai says, can we have a look at the book and see what we have to do next? And they take the book in their hands and they leaf through it. And Shira says, come, have a look at the book. Who's the mother? The mother has to wear red clothes. Now, another one is the use of book language. And this we have in a tale called A Tale About Hats. And you see they say, monkeys, give me back my hats. They are having a problem with the hats. And now you can listen to Dor using the book language. I shall be on my way. I shall go to the big city. I shall pursue my own path. I've arrived in the big city. I shall go to my village and make more hats. The next example is an example of word innovation. And Sharon, who is assigning the roles, says, he's the emperor and you're the bandit. As you can tell, this is out of frame, right? So he's the emperor and you're the bandit. So Dan says, I've never bandited. The Hebrew was אתה נוכל. So Dan said, אני אף פעם לא נחלתי. And well, Hebrew is very good for that because it's very easy with the root thing to do the inflection. So anyway, he never bandited. So then Dan says, as Asaf says, I'm the boy, and Dan specifies the innocent boy. Now, the next is an example of language enrichment. Playing after the Leah Goldberg story, A House for Rent, Dira Leaskir. Eden says, do you want to live in the new house? Do you want to go into the house? And Liron corrects her, no, say, is the house pleasant? Which of course is a line of the story. Is the house pleasant? And the word in Hebrew is na'eh. Na'eh, which is a high register word. And then Eden says, what is pleasant? And Liron says, nice. And then Eden goes ahead and says, is the house pleasant? Anyway, by the way, what I meant to do, and just now I'm remembering, is I want to point out about what's the dual The dual what space? The dual opportunity space. Okay, so what's the dual opportunity space? As you can tell, the children are playing, okay? So that's one level of the opportunity space. What is the other level? That we are talking here about language enrichment. We have talked before about all the others that we had there. What was it? Innovation of words, etc. All of these are the other level of the opportunity. So by the time we are watching and analyzing and seeing all these processes taking place, the children are not aware of that and they are happy to play, and that doesn't deter from their learning, and this is the whole issue. Now, text expansion, creative expansion. So while they are doing creative expansion, they are playing. This is the dual opportunity space. So they are playing Little Red Riding Hood, and Moore says, hey, May, you're Red Riding Hood, not White Riding Hood. And she has all these white things she's wearing. So, but I have nothing red to wear, and I'm not going to wear that ridiculous hat. So here you have an example of the in-frame, out-of-frame mobility, which is supposed to be a critical factor to account for the positive impact of pretend play on literacy. This capacity of go in and out of frame. So you come out of the play and you're in reality, and then you go back. So the thing is, she's not in reality. I mean, she's not prepared to wear any ridiculous red hat. So that's what, and now they go back. Hello to you, what's your name? I'm Red Riding Hood's mom. Thanks, White Riding Hood's mom. White Riding Hood is going to grandma. And what I would like you to notice is that some of the negotiation is carried out of frame, but some can be carried in frame. Like she's telling you, thanks, White Riding Hood. So this is a continuation, of course, of the out-of-frame argument we saw before. Okay, so what is the meta? Now we have another category, and that is the one that shows a metacognitive attitude. The children discuss the text and exchange opinions about it. No, it's a story called Kishta. So Tal says, no, it's more fun to have at least one human being. It's no fun to have only cats. Are there 2 dogs and 2 cats? No, I want a human being. Oh, a human being. Okay, so what did we learn from this? The story text has a central role in the promotion of literate discourse when pretend playing in the wake of story reading. The story structuring by children takes place while they adhere to the text, and it constitutes a source of authority for them, has an impact on vocabulary enrichment, and on the use of the written register. Interpretive expansion involves changing the story and engagement in metacognitive attitude. By the way, I omitted telling you what was the motive that brought us to do this story reading before the children went to play. That a classic complaint of kindergarten teachers who work with children from a low socioeconomic status, their claim is that children's pretend play never really takes off. That is when Paul Harris says that children who are pretend playing need to put their reality in brackets and go into a different, distant reality. The claim of so many kindergarten teachers is that actually the distance the children they are talking about go is not a very big distance. Actually, they say it's almost no distance. So the thought behind reading the story was that this would actually do the work of getting the children to get into an alternative, distant reality. And we think it did the job. On the other hand, what we didn't want was to constrain the degrees of freedom of the children. So, to a certain extent, the reading of the story did constrain the degrees of freedom, but as people who do child language know, constraints are not only a limitation, are also a facilitative factor. So this is what happened here. Anyway, what is the summary and our conclusions? Pretend play in the wake of story reading is indeed an opportunity for literacy enhancement, and it allows for the promotion of children's literacy abilities while actively engaging in authentic and relevant natural discourse with no adult intervention. That's it. Any questions?
Questions or comments?
Well, Eva, I just have to say, this is in parentheses, it's a wonderful little, it's a wonderful analysis, but there is adult management of the story and of the play after the story.
Not of the play after the story.
No, well, there is in that it's suggestive, because kids don't automatically go off after hearing a story.
No.
Play about it.
Yeah, but then
So
that's it.
Manage it, yeah. But still.
No, absolutely.
It's very powerful.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Agreed.
To go do it.
Agreed. So that's a constraint.
I just want to acknowledge the adults.
Yeah.
For a moment.
No, but you see, I hoped, I tried to make it clear that we don't want to do away with the adults. I mean, we don't want to do it. I mean, with some we certainly do, but that has nothing to do with this. That has nothing to do with this. But the point is that, well, I'll tell you what the issue is, that many educators have the feeling that when children are on their own, interacting on their own, they, the adults, are mismanaging their time. So that was the point. But
if I can, I think it's very important not to set this up as a dichotomy, because I mean the other very impressive chapter in the book that shows powerful value added of peer interaction is Agaliki Nikolopoulos, where the adult role of being the person to whom the stories are dictated, and then the person who reads the stories aloud is very crucial. So I think it's a matter of managing the adult not to interfere too much and not to interfere too little.
No, I think it's very important to understand what is the contribution of adult-child interaction, what is the contribution of child-child interaction, and what are all the shades in between and their possible contributions.
Any other questions or comments? Okay,
Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is on the right. Okay, our next presentation is by Judy Kupersmit, who was a student and cooperator in the project. And I'm leaving it to you to go on from here.
לך את המיקרופון?
תודה.
לא, לפה.
ממש פה?
מקווה ששומעים אותי. Hope you can hear me. Yeah.
זה מיקרופון לצילום. עכשיו יש פה מיקרופון שאין לו קליפס. איפה זה? זה 1, 2, זה להגברה. הבא שלו.
Okay. I hope you can hear me. Yeah. Okay. So I personally met Shoshana 4 years ago when she invited me to be part of a project called the Albjerg. And I remember that as well, I was captivated by her reasoning, her argumentation, the way she explained her points of view, her ideas, and the challenging discussions we had on different topics. For me, everything was quite new. I'm a linguist, coming from a different trend, a different current, and I'm indebted to Shoshana because through her I got more deeply exposed to the pragmatic and the sociological dimensions of language and language development in particular, and I really feel that I had the privilege to meet her and to taste a little bit of her immense knowledge and her wisdom. So the study I present today was performed in collaboration with Vibeke and Shoshana, and the talk is in her honor. So let's start. As we all know, there are many reasons why to study narratives in language development. They are early acquired, but have a long developmental route. They serve as a communicative context to practice language forms according to the principles of the genre and to acquire particular discourse functions to plan and control text production. As this poses certain demands on the child, narrative production is highly predictive of literacy and academic skills, and this is another reason to be interested in narratives. From a psycholinguistic perspective, narrative production requires the integration of top-down and bottom-up processes. And this is something that Shoshana liked always to talk about coherence and cohesion and these top-down and bottom-up processes. Going top-down, cognitive, pragmatic, and socio-cultural knowledge will support narrative coherence, such as the ability to structure the narrative, to express semantic and causal links, to take perspective on events, and so on. And the bottom-up direction reflects the ability to recruit language forms, the language forms that children know, but in the narrative context, they have to be used as cohesive devices just to meet the needs of coherence. So the vocabulary, syntactic constructions, referential expressions, tense form aspects, and the like, they have to be used to meet the needs for the text to be coherent. For bilingual children, the population of the present study, the integration between these two levels of narrative production seems quite complex and challenging, since it is affected by the relative knowledge of the language-specific forms in each language and by the interaction between the two linguistic systems in the course of L1 and L2 development. Previous form-function studies of bilingual narratives compared to monolingual have shown rather intact global narrative abilities in structuring the narrative and in referential tracking, somewhat less sophisticated lexical and morphosyntactic constructions to express various narrative functions, certain differences in expressing evaluative content, and all these, of course, depending on different factors such as dominance, language typology, literacy practices, cultural differences, and the degree of cognitive load on the task. While most studies investigated bilinguals who are rather fluent in both L1 and L2 with relatively equal linguistic competence in both languages, much less is known about narrative development in sequential bilinguals, where L2 is introduced after the L1 has been established, so the language is developing from the beginning, and a more significant gap there exists between socio-cognitive, pragmatic, and linguistic abilities. So with this reality in mind, we wanted to tap the development of narrative abilities in the developing language of sequential bilinguals from a form-function approach. And what were the aims? We wanted to evaluate the development of the main structural components and the causal links between them in the narrative. This would be the coherence. To examine the specific linguistic structures used to encode the causal links in the course of development, and to compare these two domains of narrative development in bilinguals, in bilingual narratives, which is the L2 from now, and monolingual narratives, which is the L1 narratives. Shoshana, when she tried to focus me on the research questions, she would say, you have to look for מה משתנה ומה שונה. It means what changes with age and what is different between the groups. So tapping all these things together in interaction. For this purpose, we analyzed picture-based narratives, laboratory narratives in this sense. Picture-based narratives collected as part of a longitudinal project that followed sequential bilingual children with different L1s during 4 years from their first entry to Hebrew-speaking preschool to the first years of primary school education. We collected the narratives from 23 children at 2 different times, their second and their 4th year of exposure to Hebrew as L2, when the children were 6 and 8 years old in average. And we compare their narratives to those produced by a control group of monolinguals matched for age. When talking, I will present some of the results, and when talking about the results, I will always try to show both axes, what develops with age and what are the differences between the groups. As a basis for the analysis, we first calculated story length by number of clauses, and we found no differences between the L2 and the L1 narratives, and no development with age. So in length of clauses, they were similar. The standard deviation was higher in the L2 groups, probably indicating the variability in language production abilities and in narrative style in bilinguals, because, for example, the longer texts sometimes included lots of clauses in direct speech and in a style which resembles conversation. So children actually told narratives which contain a lot of first person, conversation in the narrative. To answer the first question, we looked at the structural components of the narrative and the types of causal relations that were expressed between the components. For the analysis of the narrative components, we adopted the story grammars proposed by Stein and Glenn, which looks quite complex for this specific and short story. We will see in a minute. So this would be the kind of scheme of the narrative components, and which starts with a setting for time, place, characters, and their actions, going from right to left, as in Hebrew. Initiating event, which is the incoming bee leading to the first attempt, the cat jumping onto the bee, followed by a complex set of outcomes, which was not easy at all for the bee and for the cat, which subsequently lead to a second attempt where the perspective changes from the bee cat to the cat family, and besides, the cat role changes from being active to passive. So being washed, the cat being washed, and finally with the outcome being clean. Besides, the internal reactions as an optional category are scattered throughout the episodes. This table shows the proportion of children who mentioned the main episodic components in L1 and L2 by age. The components marked in light blue increased with age in both groups, but those in yellow, for example, the attempt, occurred significantly less in the L2 group at age 6. And the table also shows no differences at age 8. It means they closed the gap after 4 years of exposure, and differences in performance by components, So some of the components were at ceiling in all the groups or showed little development with age. Still in the first question, we wanted to look at 4 types of causal relations between the narrative components. Motivational, enabling, physical, and psychological relations, which according to the causal network model proposed by Travasso and Associates and other scholars, they can be either explicit or easily inferable throughout the text. We examined these 4 types of causal relations across the story, but the focus now is on the first episode, which involves the 4 types of causal relations. And besides, this episode was particularly interesting because it combines cause with a very complex motion event. So let me show you the complexity. We have the cat as a figure that moves through a complex path, with the bee as the goal in path, which is the more worthy goal for the cat, and the table as the end point of the movement. And it seems that this is very complex for the children to express, I mean, to encode this movement, which was central for story coherence, actually. And to this complexity, we add the 4 types of causal relations I mentioned before, the motivational, enabling, physical, and the psychological causation. And let me illustrate some examples from the text showing these 4 relations. So motivational would be between the goal and the attempt, something like, and the cat jumped to catch the fly. Enabling, between the attempt and the outcome, that is, in order to fall in on the table, you have to first jump onto the bee. Okay, so, and the cat jumped to catch the fly or the bee, but instead he jumped onto the table. Physical, between the events that compose the outcome, and the cat jumped and all the soup spilled and the cat became really dirty. And psychological, and the food spilled out and the bee went away and the mother was sad and the girl laughed. I mean, these are the internal states, emotions that can be triggered by the different events. The graph shows just one word about these relations where these were not always so simple to understand and it was not always clear that if the components were there, the relations were also occurring. For example, one of the girls in L2, the bilingual girls, would say, "Ima אמרה אוי ואבוי, הצלחת נפלה והחתול מלוכלך." So the mother said, "Oy vavoy," the plate fell down, and the cat is dirty. So it was not always, even if the components were there, the relations were not always inferable. So it was necessary to see both the components and a deeper look into the causal relationships, which actually demanded more language. This is my conclusion, and I will show you. So the graph shows that psychological causation was the most frequent overall, with no differences by group or age. Unexpectedly, the less frequent overall were physical relations. Motivational and enabling causation increased with age in both groups, but were significantly lower at age 6 in bilinguals, and enabling relations remained particularly low at age 8 in L2, among sequential bilinguals. So just to see a typical text from the bilingual group, to see the most frequent causal relations where all of them are there, but enablement is not. Suddenly there came the bee and the boy makes kishta kishta, and the cat got up and he wants to send it away, and then the mother stops. She sees the cat jumping, wants to catch the bee. And they say to him, "No, little cat, no." And then he jumped and he got dirty with the soup. He ate some. And then the mother says, "Oy vay voy," and the bee flew away. The girl laughs a little, and the boy is sad that he spilled him the soup. So we assumed that the two relations that decreased with age, which were the motivational and the enabling relations, were more demanding in terms of language and cognition. So the next question was to examine the linguistic structures, which linguistic structures were used to express the causal relations. We will focus first on the expression of these two relations, the motivational and enabling relations, via different linguistic configurations, and then we will move to a more general view of the connectivity strategies used if we have time. So motivational and enabling relations were clearly relating to the expression of the complex motion event, which I hope we can have in focus. And starting from the motion itself, most children use the verb jump or other variations that imply intentional movements such as pounced on, itnapel à la dvora. So you can see that most of them actually use this verb, but the younger L2 learners at age 6 were much less accurate. No, these are the first, the L1 at age 8 actually were using other types of verbs, and these are the 6-year-olds in L2, which were much less accurate in using the verbs. So we can see, for example, he ran to the bee, or he ate it at the end, using other verbs, but not the verb jumping. Reference to the bee as the goal in path increased with age and was expressed in 3 different ways, either by a prepositional phrase, onto the bee, by a separate clause, such as to catch the bee or wanted to catch the bee, or combining a prepositional phrase and a clause, such as jumped onto the table to catch the bee. We can see that bilinguals are delayed in referring to the goal as compared to monolinguals, even at age 8 after 4 years of exposure to Hebrew. And so some of the examples, we can see that in L2, many of the children miss the goal in path, and then the motivational relation actually cannot be inferred. So in L1, we have a hatul kafat. I will read it in English. The cat jumped and he wanted to catch the bee, while in L2, we mostly saw text such as the cat jumped and the mother saw that the cat jumps, okay, without mentioning the goal. Also, we see use of more compact constructions to express motion and goal together in L1. So when the cat jumped to catch the fly, while in L2, we generally saw expressions such as afterwards he wanted to jump onto the fly and then he jumped. So it's much, the constructions were much more linearly arranged. The information was much more linearly arranged. It was interesting to see also that almost none of the children used a specific verb such as fall or land to refer to the endpoint goal, except for 2 children in L2. And generally, when they referred to this phase of the motion explicitly, and this was only 30% of the children at age 8 and only the monolinguals at age 6, they just repeated the same verb jump, saying something such as, and he jumped onto the bee, and then he jumped onto the table. There was another kind of spatial anchoring to express enabling relations, but we don't have time to mention them. So we will just move to the other domain we looked at, which was interclausal connectivity. And it was also very insightful to look at this domain to see how it contributes to causality. We identified 3 types of connectivity: linear, such as everyone got scared and then the cat jumped onto the children's meal; coordination, the cat jumps onto the table and tried to kill the bee; or subordination, everyone was sad because the soup spilled on the table. The graph shows the proportion of the 3 types in L1 and L2 out of total clauses, and we can see that the trends which replicate, first of all, previous studies in picture-based narrative development. So linear connectivity is favored in both L1 and L2 at these ages, and this is not new, but significantly, but linear connectivity was significantly higher in L2, while coordination was more frequent in L1 and subordination was low overall. And I want to show you some examples of connectivity strategies where we can see that they can ease the interpretation of causal relations. So for example, we have emergent complexity in connecting clauses to express the enabling relations in L1, such as, and the cat jumped to catch the fly, but instead he jumped onto the table and all the soup spilled out on him, while in L2 we frequently, I'm not saying always, but much more frequently found more linear packaging in L2, even at the age of 8, after 4 years of exposure to the language. So we would find text such as, and then the cat jumped onto the fly, and then the girl and the boy, they were scared, and then she didn't say anything, and then the cat fell, and everything spilled on the table. And another example, and the cat jumped from his place toward the fly, and the fly landed on the soup, and then the cat landed on the soup. And these examples were very interesting because even when the lexicon was already there, it was already specific, using specific verbs, jumped and landed, and here jumped and then fell, still we could see this tendency to use this linear arrangement of clauses, which many times hampered or rather obscured the interpretation of causal relations. So the conclusions, we can say that story components and expression of causal links increase with age in both groups, but were delayed at L2, in L2 at age 6. This means that the assumed underlying universal command of top-down narrative abilities cannot be fully activated or exploited until narrators reach a certain linguistic threshold. It is also important to say that the gap between L2 and N1, as we saw, disappeared at age 8. But at that age, story structuring was still developing in both groups, in L1 and L2. We also conclude that the expression of story components and causal links are very much affected by the degree of event complexity, prototypicality, and perceptual saliency, and of course, language demand of the specific scenes. And this is actually true for both groups, not only for bilinguals. For example, perceptual saliency in facial expressions and the body gestures, which we had a lot of facial expressions in this story, seems to enhance the expression of psychological causation throughout the story. And this finding, I think, has interesting implications for the role of emotions in second language learning. And it echoes the claim made by scholars such as Tomasello, Blum, Aukrust would say that in the search for comprehension of emotions and intentions becomes actually the driving force behind the search for meaning in language acquisition. And I'm tempted to claim, following also Travasso and Stein, who say that in the context of narratives, emotions are the most basic form of causality, like the basic glue between events in story production as a first step in the construction of meaning. And this is what I can see here. It was so easy, it seems to be so easy for speakers, also in L2, to talk about emotions, to refer to emotions in the context of a narrative. And we also propose that expressing psychological causation demands less of a linguistic effort as a range of expressions, including direct speech expressions and very frequent verbs of emotional states can be used. I mean, I think the children can be more creative when they talk about emotions than when they have to produce very specific, much more cognitive demanding or linguistic demanding information and connect between events. But this was not in the case of psychological causation. On the other hand, we can see that causal relations such as enablement or motivation require in this context required much more lexical specificity and the use of linguistic configurations which seem not to be acquired until late in L2 development. So looking at this domain specifically, we found that the linguistic encoding of the episodic components and the causal links seems to be delayed in L2, even at age 8, which means 4 years after they were exposed to the language, to Hebrew. In general, we found more linear connectivity strategies, less accurate encoding of events, and in general, both in L2 and L1, event complexity, specifically where we have causality and motion together, complex motion events, may be affecting the linguistic encoding of these complex scenes. And this can be an interesting point, I think, for future research. The difficulty to express motion events with complex paths at this age, it is not clear whether it is the cognitive load imposed by the narrative task or the complexity of the motion events what causes this delay. And in this specific story, it's just so important for coherence that at this point in the narrative, if children were not able to express this enabling relation, the story would lose the coherence. So I think it is important to emphasize here the need to explore the interaction between coherence and cohesion to understand how language-specific and language-universal abilities interact in narrative development. As Hickman, stated from Hickman, accounts focusing on only one of these aspects of discourse organization, coherence or cohesion separately will provide an incomplete picture of children's abilities, which is insufficient for us to be able to understand the nature of their narrative competence. And to conclude, we can see and say that parallel processes needed to organize the narrative and select the appropriate linguistic forms may be challenging in the L2 development, where coherence and cohesion do not always seem to develop together. And then there is the need to integrate form with function in narrative analysis to capture more subtle linguistic, cognitive, and pragmatic interfaces in L2 development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions, comments?
Maybe one question is related, but perhaps not related directly, but you're talking about L1 and L2 in a way as separate entities, right? I think what we see a lot today is this translanguaging or hybridity, especially for immigrant kids. I myself work with multilingual testing, language. So I wondered whether the fact that they're not parallel, they're not exactly the same processes, whether you'd consider something of looking at both languages simultaneously in a more mixed way.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I mean, if you could repeat the question, because I'm not sure I could actually. What do you mean by in?
Translanguaging.
Yes.
Really for people are not doing total separation between the two languages, especially with immigrant kids.
Yeah.
Enabling.
Okay. Yeah.
Using both.
Yes. Transferring. Yeah. Yeah.
Good ways.
Mm-hmm.
So this research, which is very good and very interesting.
Yeah, yes. In this specific research, we didn't consider at all the L1s. I mean, I know that there are stories collected from in L1, but they were not analyzed. I think they were not transcribed, and we didn't consider the trans language, as you say. It just didn't. I couldn't understand how you use this term. No, we didn't consider that. I mean, the cross-language interference, or yeah.
I understand that from that research. I'm just kind of proposing something for the future.
No, sure. I think it's very important. I think it's a very good question and a very good comment. But we didn't consider how the first languages may be influencing. Yeah, yes, it was not considered in this particular study.
Well, thank you all very much. We could still spend 5 or 10 minutes if anyone wants to say something or share something with us. Since I said it's not that formal, it's open to the participants. Would anybody like to say anything? No? If not, I want to thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.